Do you remember how big the world was? What I mean is this. Do you remember the first time you visited a place as an adolescent or a young adult that was once very familiar to you, years earlier from when you were a small child? I remember the first time returning to a favorite family pizza restaurant, and after being gone for several years, I looked around and I thought, I remember this place being so much bigger. I could see over the countertops now. My daughter, of course, reminds me of this feeling as I watch her navigate a world that must feel for her like it was created for giants. As she pulls at drawers that are chest height or over her head, and opening cabinets that are as tall as she is. Of course, she's got that whole life ahead of her of being diminutive stature, but you know. And something that I realized was stories too can be the same way. Looking back at stories that were big and impressive and spacious for me as a child, I can see what's troubling or small or simplistic in the stories that formed me when I was small. If you happen to be raised in church, classic Sunday school stories can be this way. Like this week's first reading about David and Goliath. This story is so familiar that it is cliche, as it appeals not only to children, but also plays into the very American narrative of the scrappy yet likable underdog beating the big, powerful, behemoth bad guy. When you stop to think about it, this general story arc is the inspiration for countless movies for children and adults alike. In popular culture, the narrative is, it doesn't matter how big the problem is, you can overcome any obstacle or adversity with some grit, perseverance, and luck. In religious circles, people might add, with God, anything is possible. And all of this is fine and true, to a point. But I've seen enough real human suffering to feel this narrative is smaller than what I remember as a child. Here are some questions that I personally find troubling in this story. What about the violence that is inherent in the story of David and Goliath? What about the assumption that David's God is stronger than Goliath's God because David beat Goliath in a duel? Isn't that a problematic assumption? Or how about the broader context of war between Israel and the Philistines in this biblical text? How does that description of that ancient war influence the way people of faith relate to the stories people tell about the current war between Israel and Hamas? And the stories that people tell or don't tell about the over 37,000 Palestinians who have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. It's tempting to ignore this story or set it aside and leave it as a small, uncomfortable, perhaps Sunday school relic and talk about Jesus instead. But I think that to do that is a loss. To minimize a story that's been handed down from our spiritual ancestors, a story that's older than Jesus. I think acknowledging and sitting with the discomfort and the problematic is important. And it also, to ignore it, misses an opportunity to see the ways in which the story is bigger than anything we might have ever imagined. In fact, this story would have been a sacred story that Jesus learned in his faith formation as a young Jewish boy growing up under military occupation. I wonder if Mary was the one that taught it to him, or Joseph. Did he learn it in the synagogue or the temple? Did this story cross his mind when he and his friends were on a small boat in a big storm? But that's a sermon for another day. back to David and Goliath and why this story matters. In reading and rereading this story and pondering the questions I found troublesome in the text, there's something that I noticed. In this story, God is silent. David invokes God. Saul sends David forth in the name of God. Goliath mocks God. God is named, but does not, as a character in the story, speak. What was God thinking in this story? What was God doing? God does not tell David what to do, at least not directly. Was David improvising? Have you ever felt this way? You find yourself or your family or your community facing a monumental challenge. You're afraid, or maybe everyone around you is, and God, it seems, is silent. You look around and realize you don't know what it is, but you feel compelled to do something. Maybe you invoke God. Maybe you don't. Maybe you seek some blessings and pray. But fundamentally, you're improvising as best you can with what you've got. You might feel like a bit of an imposter, but actually, this experience, these actions, are fundamentally the very actions of faith, as old as the story of David. Because here's the thing, God will work with you. We are empowered to improvise because God will work with us. That's all God ever does with humanity and with all of creation since the beginning of time. Recognizing this creates a paradoxical space in the story for both bold action and humility. We act because we know God is at work, redeeming and restoring creation. And even as we take a risk or face a challenge, we do this with humility and perspective. Even the actions with the best of intentions don't mean we're going to get it right, or we're going to succeed or be victorious, or even that we're always doing God's will, even if that's what is our intention. We can know and acknowledge we're improvising. And God will improvise with and through us. There's another often overlooked detail in this story that's worth noticing. David viewed his life experiences as preparing him for this moment. That's the story David told himself and others. When Saul said, "You can't face that guy. You don't have the life experience or the war experience for that matter," David looked back on his life and said, "The adversities I've faced until now, the lion and the bear in the field, they've prepared me for this moment." Incidentally, it also gives you a different perspective of Jesus the Good Shepherd, right? Anyway, I remember feeling this way of preparation and ferocity for a time after having my daughter, Penelope. I'd survived childbirth. I could face anything. It's a powerful worldview. What if we viewed present moments of adversity through the lens of what we've survived? Caring for aging parents as preparation for facing our own aging and mortality. Surviving the last school year as preparation for getting through the next. And it's interesting. In one breath, David speaks of how he fought off the lion and the bear, and in the very next, he acknowledges God's providence through those times of trial. He didn't do it, God protected him through it. But it's not one or the other. Both are true at the same time, in equal measure. One final overlooked detail which expands the story of David and Goliath. Our successes become our failures. And the reverse is true. Our failures become our successes. Here's what happened with David. I don't know if you heard it in the reading, but he didn't wear any armor facing Goliath. He tried it on and said, "This isn't for me. I don't know what to do with it." David's distinguishing characteristic in his confrontation with Goliath was how unwarrior-like he was. It was his experience as a shepherd, not as a soldier, that made him different. Helped him to see the situation with Goliath differently than anybody else around him. But it's amazing how quickly David, after his success on the battlefield, takes up armor. It's in the very next chapter. And what's more, his victory over Goliath catapults him into success and power. He becomes a charismatic military leader and becomes king over Israel. Fast forward in his military success, and it becomes his liability. He abuses his power, using war as an excuse to send a man, a military captain, to his death by commanding him to lead the charge in a hopeless battle. Actually, King Saul did the same thing to David, incidentally, but David survived. Uriah, the commander that David sent out, did not. This was all so that David could take Uriah's wife for his own. It's uncomfortable to realize that our successes become our failures, and I really wish it wasn't true. But in his book, Falling Upward, Richard Rohr describes the paradoxical approach of any wise spiritual director. When a student experiences some great success, the spiritual director thinks, no good will come of this. But after some catastrophic failure, the spiritual director knows there's some great material to work with. Maybe you're feeling like a catastrophic failure, like you'll never amount to much. It's not true. It is in the failures, it is during the seasons of life when we experience our own undoing, that God is the most active. Or maybe you're at a point in your life when your successes aren't feeling like enough. That all outward appearance to the contrary, but has always worked for you before, somehow doesn't seem to be working in the same sort of way. It's tempting to double down, to think you only have to work harder to replicate previous success. That's not how it works. This is an invitation to try something totally different, trusting that all your paths until now have prepared you for the present moment. The story of David and Goliath, of all things, is not an invitation to victory, but to vulnerability, to improvise, to feel afraid, but to have the courage to act as best we can, as faithfully as we can. God will improvise with us. It's all God ever does. This is a story that is older than Jesus, older than the story of David even, and big enough and spacious enough to hold us and all our stories here and now, today. Amen.